This is Audible.
Gaz Act1, Prophet of the War, written by Nate Crowley, read by Kelly Houghton.
Paul Putner and John Rand.
Oi, Flex. Oi.
My name is Titanida Neverzina Folks, and I am a Lord Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos. As you well know, this conversation will not proceed until you address me appropriately.
A Lord Inquisitor now, is it? Only a lord, we reckon. There's no one stronger than you to say you ain't a Lord, Flax. And we don't reckon that's the way things are. Reckon you're in the drops with your bosses for consorting with the likes of us.
The word is consorting, and yes, it would not aid my position with the Ordo if these messages were intercepted.
That's right. You told us not to call you outside. What was it again, Lord Flax?
The most dire and pressing strategic necessity was my phrasing, Orc, and yet I note this link has been used twice in the last solar rotation, just to send me crude insults. This had better not be a third.
Yeah, we were going to do just that. Suppose there was a thing about Gaz Act1 too, but that don't matter really, does it? Shouldn't have called. Go in there.
Tell me. I'll pay. Just tell me what you know.
He ain't dead. Chopping off his head didn't work.
This is known.
But when you dropped the big space station on him, didn't work neither. The boss ain't even hurt. He's stronger.
Stronger? Explain yourself, Xenos.
You're rude, ain't you, bursting in like that? Bad diplomacy. Anyway, we don't know. We got out of Krongar sharpish, but on the way out we snatched someone who does know what you want to know. Someone, what's the word? Significated. They know the big boss, plans, weaknesses, everything. Thought you might be interested.
Who is this captive?
10 guns and 10 bullets. 10 big guns and big bullets to go with them. A map with 10 planets who ain't expecting to be raided. That's the price.
Who?
10 and 5 planets we can raid then, if you want to know the name and all. And another 10 guns.
This filth wastes our time with jests. And besides, such a price is unthinkable. Even for you, Inquisitor.
He's rude to you and all, ain't he? Thought he was a lord. If you are, the decision's yours, ain't it? What's it to be, Flax?
Brother Hendrickson is correct, mercenary. It is out of the question. I don't care how big a war boss you have kidnapped, their ranting is not worth Imperial lives.
We never said they was big, nor a war boss. We said they was significated. Ever heard of Makari?
Surely they take us for fools, Lord Folks. Terminate the...
Deal. Rendezvous with us in the shadow of Pulsar Acherontia 12 at the location specified in the Hammerhead Deeps, with your engines silenced. I will meet your price. Just remember what you lost last time that you tried to cheat me.
Didn't lose much, and I like my new heart better anyway. But don't worry, we won't do nothing funny.
Your double negative does not reassure me.
All right then, we won't trick you. Deal's proper. Blood Axe promise.
Blood Axe promise. This is madness, Inquisitor. This Makari is not even real. He is a Xenos myth, a butt for their crude jokes.
Makari's real enough, grey words, and there ain't nobody knows the big boss better. Little Git's seen everything over the years.
We would see the warlord dead, alien. Not learn his life story.
What is it you lot say about knowledge and power? You reckon you know Thraka because of Armageddon? Not likely. You don't know the half of what's coming.
I know enough that...
Enough, both of you. I have agreed to the bargain. We will meet at Acherontia, where I will receive the captive. Pray to your strange gods, Orc. that it proves worth the cost.
Interrogation 1. Folks could hear it breathing in the dark. Short, hissing breaths, like the exhalations of forge bellows. Quiet, but crouched forever on the brink of a snarl. Hot, damp, and tinged with the stink of an impossible metabolism. The breath of a monster. The imperial truth had told her she had nothing to fear, that this monster was weak and scrawny, barely larger or more dangerous than a malnourished human child. And having immersed herself in the ever-shrinking comfort of the Pax Imperialis for too long, Folks could almost believe it might be so. She wanted to believe. But humanity could not simply wish its enemies into inferiority, any more than a shepherd could wish away the gleam of predatory eyes at the edge of a campfire's light. And, as Folks saw it, the Imperium's fire had long burned down to embers. The hungry dark was closing in, and realities had to be confronted. Most in her order sought solace in zeal, huddling ever closer to the dying flames of faith as they might offer protection, rather than blinding them to the glint of onrushing teeth. Folks had chosen long ago to turn and face the dark instead. It had cost her most of whatever hope her youth had accrued. But somehow, after 130 years, keeping the night at bay, the dregs of that hope remained. Steadying herself, as she had done 1,000 times before, she forced her hand to the switch that would reveal her foe, and prepared to lose a little more. The cell's overhead lamp flickered into life, casting a cold circle on steel, and all the way down the length of the brig things stirred in a jungle of rivets, shutters and bars. As a frigate of the Ordo Xenos, the shipwrights had built the Severismus Exactor with a containment deck fit to hold the menagerie of a planetary governor, and Folks had filled it with horrors. There were entities down here that had not walked free in decades, beasts without names, and nightmares that wore the skins of men. They rustled as they scurried from the sudden light before falling into sullen silence once more. But the object of her attention did not even stir in its chains. It just stared at her, with a steady focus that suggested it had been watching her just as keenly in the dark. It was a Gretchen, as promised. An orc slave beast, sharing the fundamentals of their biology, but without such exuberance of form. Still, as ever with its kind, it was larger than Folks had expected it to be. It would have stood to her chin if it was upright, and there was certainly nothing childlike about it. It was thin-limbed and slender, but its hands spanned twice the width of a human's, while the long bones of its limbs were wrapped in muscle as dense and knotted as a catachan, stranglevine. Folks knew to be wary. Even though the creature was restrained, life had taken her far away from bar fights, but she remembered her drinking days well enough to know it wasn't the big, belligerent fighters you watched out for. It was the bastards built like this. The ones who'd disappear as soon as a glass was thrown, then make themselves known later via a forearm round the throat, and the sudden collapse of a lung on a knife tip. And even in the frigid cell, soaked with chill from the void beyond the hull, it glowed with life. Wisps of steam rose from its shoulders, venting the waste heat from its metabolic furnace, and she swore that in the silence of the brig she could hear the rush of blood through its gnarled veins. Folks's lip curled as she looked over its snaggled teeth, its gristly proboscis of a nose, its ragged bat-wing ears. While its face was laid out in the manner of a human's, topology was all it shared in common. Beneath that rubbery green skin, the architecture of its skull was thoroughly, repulsively alien. As Fawkes examined her captive, its lips drew back into a thin, vicious smile, and its head tilted slowly to one side. It was evaluating her in turn. She wondered, what did it see? An old woman, if the distinction meant anything to the sexless creature, with a shock of brittle hair she had once dyed white, but which had saved her the effort ever since she had spent a week in hiding beneath the Harood nest on Calamant. A face she had often heard euphemized as striking, built around a jaw like a cruiser's prow, and with little flesh to spare around its edges. Hatched with scars, bronzed by the glare of strange suns, and so often in a cast of defiant scorn that it had been etched in permanence. Fawkes thought of it as a hard face. But as those murky, pupilless red eyes probed her, looking for places to throttle and gouge and gnaw, it felt like scant armour. Her scalp began to prickle where it met the ceramite of her skull plate at the nape of her neck, and the spell was only broken by the thud of heavy bootsteps approaching the cell door. "It stinks," sneered Brother Hendrickson, as he ducked under the lintel and threw his ship coat to the floor with the mundane disgust of a man setting to the unblocking of a recalcitrant sewage duct. The old rune priest was not reserved in displaying his emotions. Eyebrows, like the pelts of moderately sized ship rats, furrowed down over his bright green eyes, while russet moustaches braided like bell ropes shifted as his nose wrinkled, exposing a grimace the width of a baseline human's hand. "Could you not have hosed it down before we started?" Hendrickson grumbled, rolling up the sleeves of his fatigues to reveal forearms like grox shins, tattooed with spirals of indigo runes. "This morning's meat was good enough, as ship rations go, but I've no wish to taste it again." Despite his griping, Hendrickson could not have been less disconcerted by the whole business. It was as if he saw their prisoner as a task rather than a creature, and his workmanlike disdain chased away the eerie, choking unease that had filled the room before his arrival. Indeed, Fawkes had always found the darkness much easier to face with a quarter-ton of Adeptus Astartes Psyche beside her, no matter how much the man complained. "They shall know no fear indeed," she thought to herself, letting the edge of a smile push at the callus of some forgotten wound. "I'm not sure a smell like that can be washed away, Orm," Fawkes answered, as she considered the evidence of her nose for the first time. Hendrickson was right. The Gretchen stank. Its tattered jerkin reeked of badly cured leather, and besides the strange necklace that hung over it, a length of dried tendron threaded with rounded, irregular lumps of metal that stretched the definition of the word jewellery. It wore nothing else. Every fold of its skin was caked in grease and grime, and hummed with the odour of stale, alien sweat. It was the smell of a species to whom hygiene was an unknown concept. But beneath it, somehow more overpowering despite its subtlety, was a deeper tang. Algal, like a stagnant pond, or a hive-whirled food factory with poor ventilation and underlaid with complex, volatile scents that brought to mind spilled promethium. "I suppose it shall be worse when we open it up," said Hendrickson, briefly eclipsing the cell's lamp as he stalked over to inspect the Gretchen more closely. Even in his shipboard fatigues, with only the sigil of his old chapter donned by way of armour, Hendrickson outmassed the prisoner several times over, but it seemed unbothered as his rune-inked cliff of a face loomed down to stare it out. Folks almost warned him not to get too close, but stopped her tongue. Hendrickson was death watch after all, even if his current standing with the chamber militant was as murky as her own with the Ordo. He knew the nature of the beast just as well as she did. He might not have shared her caution, but then he did not share her humanity either. As if to punctuate the point, the prisoner lunged forwards in its shackles, jaws splayed hideously. But before Folks had even registered the motion, Hendrickson's arm had swung out in a backhand blow that snapped the thing's nose with a pop of gristle and sent it crashing to the floor along with the chair it was secured to. The sons of Fenris knew nothing of bar fights, Folks remembered, because any bar fight dire enough to draw in one of their number was swiftly reclassified as a massacre. She had learned this on the occasion she had first met Orm Hendrickson, 96 years prior, and the last day she had ever taken a drink. "It's no coward, at least," Hendrickson grunted, wiping mucus from his fist with a rag, and Folks nodded grimly. The prisoner was unusual in that regard. For all their wiry strength, she had never encountered one of the subservient Orcoids with anything less than a complete aversion to a straight fight, let alone the appetite to challenge an opponent 5 times its size while restrained in irons. "Indeed," she said. "But then, if those pirates were telling the truth, I dare say this beast has seen far worse brutes than you in its time. I hear orcs grow quite large, you know." "No matter," replied Hendrickson, hauling the toppled chair upright again with one hand. "I'll still find its limits soon enough, as sure as cold finds the holes in an old fur." As the captive glowered at him past its collapsed nose, he took a step back to regard it, then crouched down to its eye level and pulled a slim knife from his belt. "Why the rush, Orm?" came a new voice, thick and warm as engine oil, as the third member of the interrogation detail entered the chamber. "We're at least 3 days out from the Mulciber Yards, even if the warp's kind to us. There's time at least to try talking before the knives come out." Hendrickson glanced round irritably, then rose to his full height again as Cassia appeared at the cell's entrance. He still had to look up, though. As Folks was a foot taller than the Gretchen, and Hendrickson a foot taller than her, Cassia was taller still. Her great ochre boulder of a head stooping as she squeezed her shoulders through the door. Cassia, after all, was an Ogren. The battered canvas of her shipcoat creaked as she stood upright again, and as she moved towards the prisoner it was like watching a storm system drifting in. "Budge, shaman!" she rumbled, prompting a hiss of exasperation from Hendrickson, but still the rune priest stepped out of the way. The pair's constant antagonism had underscored countless shifts on the exactor's bridge, but any real enmity had long been buried under mutual respect, and they seemed to snipe at each other out of habit now more than anything else. With the calm attention of a technician, the giant sank to one knee in front of the prisoner, and moved a hand as wide as a landmine through the air before its face. The captive did not stir this time. Either its aggression had been cowed, or it realized it might as well have been faced with the prospect of biting a rock. "Let's have a sniff, then," murmured Cassia, furrowing her slab of a brow. Her eyes narrowed in concentration, and as her jaw shifted with a slow ripple of muscle and fat, the air between her hand and the prisoner shimmered. Then something snapped. It was a sensation that Folks had never quite got used to, a slow build-up of tension that you wouldn't be aware of at all, until some ephemeral dam broke and it all rushed somewhere else, sleeting through you with a feeling like a week-long migraine condensed into a heartbeat. Then it would be gone, leaving only the faintest smell of ozone, and you wouldn't be able to remember what it had felt like at all. Folks didn't like it. It had been an ordeal enough over the years to cope with Hendrickson's exercise of the art, and he, at least, had refined his methods through centuries of training. Now with Cassia, she had 2 psychers in her retinue. An Ogren psyker, thought Fawkes, and shook her head in wonder. Naturally, the imperial truth held that Ogrens were stupid, just like it said that Gretchen were weak. They were gigantic, hardy abhumans whose bodies had grown into fortresses against the harsh worlds their ancestors had marooned them on. And as common wisdom had it, this fortitude had come at the expense of their wits. Most thought them incapable of 3-syllable words, or even counting beyond their supply of bolt-shell-thick digits. And without a doubt, the truth insisted that Ogrens could never, ever muster the cerebral sophistication to manifest psychic talent. Fawkes was willing to concede that this last insistence at least might have been the case until recently. But these were strange days, and while the guardians of the imperial dogma might not have been willing to change their minds on such matters, there was no doubt that, across the countless worlds in their sway, minds were changing nonetheless. And thus, Cassia. She had lived an Ogren's life, born in a work camp, drafted to a penal regiment, and sent to the nearest front in the hope that the spending of her life might keep the front from collapsing for a fraction of a second longer. That would have been the sum of indentured conscript C455I's life, were it not for the moment where, during the fighting retreat from the Del Concar Chemish Secundus, she had moved the burning hulk of a downed bomber to shield her unit's commissar from mortar fire using nothing but her mind. In that moment, she had also moved herself far outside the imperial truth. Her commissar's duty had been clear: to align reality with the truth immediately, and indeed somewhere in the mountainous strata of the Departamento Munitorum records, a single line in a report attested to C455I's execution on the spot for cowardice. But that commissar had owed Fawkes a favour, and so the Severismus exactor had flown to Carchemish and left with an undocumented Ogren aboard. Cassia, as she had named herself, had a lot to learn about her new capabilities. Her potential, it seemed, was immense. But that would only make it harder for her to grow into it. Ahead of her life was a life spent walking an ever-narrowing path above an abyss of madness. But it would at least be a life. And she knew that for all his outward hostility to her, Hendrickson was quietly dedicated to ensuring she made the best of herself.
"It's got secrets, this one,"
said Cassia, after digesting whatever she had gleaned from the grot's mind.
"I should hope it has secrets,"
growled the old wolf,
"given what the Inquisitor paid for it. And I was about to start extracting them until you blundered in like a mastodon missing 2 legs.
It was then, to the surprise of everyone in the cell, that the second Xenos in the room spoke up.
"Perhaps,"
it offered, raising a talon-tipped finger in a disconcertingly accurate mimicry of the human gesture,
"you might start by asking a question."
Every face in the room turned to regard the green figure lurking against a bulkhead outside the circle of light cast by the cell's lamp, and Fawkes felt herself stiffen at the sound of its voice. It was quiet and snuffling, every word strung together from grunts like those of a beast at a trough, but, despite coming from a larynx built expressly for the delivery of threats and commands, it was polite. That was unsettling enough. But worse yet was the fact that, despite having been in the cell the whole time, despite Fawkes having posted it there herself just before she came down, she had entirely forgotten the beast's presence. Orcs were not stealthy, not by anyone's measure of the truth, least of all their own. But then Biter, or bites face of the face biter before it can bite, in its own unwieldy speech, was far from a typical orc. They were an interpreter, a so-called intelligence officer for the pirate warband which had abducted the asset, and their services had been loaned to Fawkes for a further extortionate sum. When it had transpired that said asset didn't understand a word of high or low Gothic. The warband did not call themselves a warband, of course. They called themselves a company, for they were blood axes, and shared their wider clan's fascination with human military culture. Embarrassingly then, Biter had come aboard draped in a poorly tailored facsimile of a militarum officer's greatcoat, stitched from patchily tanned squig leather and adorned with a sagging peaked cap. They had even awarded themselves a row of medals fashioned from hammered flat scrap metal. And yet, for all that their appearance was ridiculous, the orc had been compliant, and for lack of a better word, professional, since coming aboard. So that Fawkes had made the mistake of ceasing to perceive them as a constant threat. But in her long and secret dealings with the Bloodaxe clan, she had learned that orc allies were just enemies who hadn't seen an opportunity for betrayal yet. She would have to keep a closer eye on Biter. "You're being paid for translation, not advice," Fawkes said, eyes moving from her captive to the orc like the flicker of a sniper's targeting dot. "But, as it happens, I concur. Blade away, please, Brother Hendrickson." "As the greenskin wishes," scoffed the space wolf, sheathing the knife with an expression of distaste. "I'm sure this Macari will be more than amenable to a robust exchange of views after all, so please be my guest." Hendrickson swept his arm towards the interrogation chair as if inviting Fawkes to her seat at a feast. She stepped forward again to stand in front of the captive and tried to ignore the carnivorous smile sliding back across its face. "I want to know Gazkel Mac Uruk Thraka," said Fawkes, staring into the darkness of the prisoner's eyes as her words were relayed through Biter in a string of grunts and soft glottal barks. "I want to know all you know of Thraka, from the first moment to the last, and nothing less." Biter's translation of her words tailed off, but the prisoner just sat in silence, unblinking, with that smirk still fixed on her. She was on the brink of calling for Hendrickson's knife, after all, when it at last spoke. In contrast to the orc, its voice was wet and scratchy, squeezed out like the last words of a strangled man and dripping with malevolence. "Macari says they will tell you everything," said Biter with an air of faint discomfort. "But they say there is something you must understand first. Macari says that to know Gazkul, you must first know Macari, and to know Macari, you must know what it is to be a grot." Hendrickson inhaled, ready to protest the prisoner's time-wasting, but Fawkes stilled him with a hand while keeping her eyes on the prisoner. "Tell me then," she said, "what that is." The captive spoke for a good while, and Biter picked absently at their tusks while nodding along before addressing Fawkes. "Whatever the gods gave the orcs," the interpreter began, "whatever battle bliss kicks all the fear and worry out of their lives, they didn't give us. We live in their world, but we weren't built for enjoying it. We live to serve, and we suffer through every bit of it, except them moments when something weaker than us is suffering." "It said all that?" asked Cassia, raising a doubting eyebrow. "There were more profanities," admitted Biter, showing an inch of yellowed fangs as their mouths contorted horribly. "And I corrected some syntax, but yes, Makari said all that." Biter's eloquence had taken Fawkes entirely by surprise, and she realised now that the expression on the orc's face was their attempt at a smug grin. "You must hate the orcs," Fawkes said to the Gretchen, probing at what she hoped might be the edge of common ground, and the prisoner's eyes flickered in recognition of the words hate and orcs. "Gits!" it hissed, glaring straight at Biter, and the orc shrugged their slab shoulders. There was no need to translate that. But then the grot looked back at Fawkes and spoke further. "There's more to it, though," said Biter slyly, as the prisoner ranted. "They hate us, surely. This is no surprise to you, But it is... The blood axe paused for a moment. "You might call it faith, perhaps?" "Give me the prisoner's words, orc, not your own," demanded Fawkes, struggling with the idea. "Orcs hurt grots. Grots hate orcs. Makari says it is the axe work of the gods." "Axe work," interjected Hendrickson, frowning in concentration as if he half grasped the idea. "Hit things till the shape is good, literally. Design might be the other way to say it," pondered Biter, causing Hendrickson to tilt his head and lift his eyebrows in grudging acceptance. "Oscar Beden," we said in Fenris. "It is much the same." "I will remember that," said Biter, with studied neutrality before resuming the translation. "Orc cruelty to grots, and their loathing in return. It's good. It's the way of the great green, the way things were in the Eton now and the way they'll be in the new forever. The great green it's like a fungus with many roots, many parts. Orcs, grots, and all the rest. Orcs are best, but they're all vital. Without us to serve 'em, the orcs would falter, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's down to us grots to remind 'em of their own part in the whole. Yeah, we hate the orcs, but still we serve 'em, 'cause that's how the gods want it. And for all the pleasures the gods didn't let us have, they did give us." Biter halted, gnawing on a leathery green lip while rummaging for the word. "An ecstasy for seeing their will done good." The cell fell into silence then, as the interrogators grappled with this revelation of Gretchen ontology. Hendrickson, ever the least patient of them when it came to Xenos philosophy, abandoned the effort in seconds. Signetti's 2-day-old turd would speak more sense," he snarled as the knife returned to his hand yet again.
Enough of these attempts to confound us with your Xenos-Gatton riddles. Lord Folks asked about Gazkul, so this Makari will tell us of Gazkul. Gazkul, repeated Hendrickson directly to Makari with slow contempt as he waved the knife in the air. Gazkul, parroted the Gretchen, emphasizing the weird, gulping native pronunciation as if to correct him, then repeating it 3 times more in an increasingly sly tone. Gazkul, Gazkul, Gazkul. It tilted its head from side to side as if trying to see the underneath of an idea, and then rattled off a decisive string of hisses and barks to Biter. So be it, said the interpreter with an open-palmed gesture. You want the story of Gazkul Mac Uruk Thraka. You shall have it, humans. It may not be the story you expect, though. It may not be the story you like, either. But I shall tell it all the same. It is a story that ends in green. But it begins in white.
Chapter 1. The Birth of Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka. Snow, as far as you could see, and you couldn't see far because of the blizzard, but there was miles and miles of it. And then there was green, just a speck, mind, a hand, still soft, steaming from the sack, and torn where it had clawed its way up from its grow hole. That hand was struggling. It groped around for something to pull the rest of itself up by, but the storm had been long and bitter, and the ground could have been iron. The hand was in luck, though. A tundra squig, half-starved, saw it in a gap between the flurries and lumbered over to snap it up. Big mistake, because before it could even chew through the wrist, that hand wrapped around the root of its tongue, yanked back like it was starting a chain chopper, and pulled the squig's guts right out of its gob. Now, squig guts, you see, are nice and hot, full of juice. They softened the ground where the hand came up, just enough to loosen it a tiny bit more. And with a grunt and a heave, an orc was born in blood and bile and fungus. It weren't Gazkul, not yet. Weren't anybody. But it was a scrap of green that might become somebody, might become anybody, if it could make it through the next few hours. Lots don't make it through those hours, but this one did. Made it through days, in fact, even though the storm never let up. Made it many, many tusk lengths through the snow, wrapped in a squig's shaggy hide and made strong with its meat, till it showed up at the gates of Gogduf and banged to be let in. Gogduf was a Goth fort. Not much of a place, really, just a row of barrack sheds, a squig pen, a brew hut, and a mech shop with a busted generator packed inside a rusty wall. It wasn't somewhere you just walk up to without a good reason, because Goths don't much take to visitors. But the newcomer did just walk right up to it, for no reason other than he wanted to, stepping over drifts of bullet-smashed bones until they got to the gates. Gogduf's chief was in the gatehouse tower that day, giving the guards a beasting over something or other, so they were the first to see the newcomer. They clearly had some nerve, the chief reckoned, and the pelt on their back was a big un, so they had some fight to them too. In fact, it was the pelt that saved the newcomer. When one of the guards jumped on the tower shooter to gun 'em down, hoping to get out the drops with the chief, they only earned themselves another slap, 'cause the chief coveted that fine black squig skin, see, and didn't fancy it full of holes. So they went down to the gate to get it in person. And as soon as the gate opened, the newcomer walked up and they headbutted the chief. Oof! Of course, the chief just laughed at that and beat the stripling to a pulp before taking the pelt and heading back into the fort. But as the gate began to close, they came over all soft and shouted for Gogdoff Doc to have the unconscious newcomer dragged in and fed. Who knows why? Maybe the headbutt had reminded them of their own youth, made 'em wistful. Goths can be sentimental like that. Or maybe it was the gods speaking, Maybe the headbutt was the god speaking. The newcomer healed up quick and made himself useful enough around the barracks to be taken on as a trooper. All that meant was a tin helmet, a rusty chopper, and their own heads weight in meat every day. But it was enough. They joined one of Gogduff's mobs for raid after raid on other clans' forts, and they got strong. While fighting a bunch of bad moons over the wreck of an old stomper, they even got themselves a shooter off a dead enemy, and they learnt to use that too. And though there weren't much knowledge to be found in a place like Gogduff, the newcomer learned. They learned what it meant to be an orc. They learned about the gods. In the fight shed, they met Gork. And at the brew hut's dice table over rounds and rounds of clattering snottling knuckles, they met Mork. The newcomer's education wasn't entirely religious, though. They also learned about something called the Galaxy, where there were millions and millions of other worlds to fight on, and that this planet, Urk, the troopers called it, was just one of them. Most orcs would have been satisfied at that, but the newcomer kept asking the chief about Urk and the Galaxy and stuff. Usually they got a smack in return for being weird, but one night, as all the mobs packed the brew hut to guzzle grog stolen from the Evil Sons convoy, the old goth, must have been in a good mood, decided they'd answer the newcomer. Urk, the goth said, was a pile of Grot's turds, baked to cinders round its middle and frozen hard everywhere else, with barely anything to fight over besides a scrap from fights that had happened before. But it was their pile of Grot's turds, and so it was a good place. There were other people in the galaxy, the chief explained, who sometimes tried to own places that rightfully belonged to the orcs, which was to say, all of them, and Urk had been trespassed on plenty over the years. Once, long ago, by skinny weak things with pointy ears and stupid hats, and then later on by some massive lizards made out of crystal or something, and so on. The chief had got properly into the story now, and half the brew hut had stopped wrestling and knife fighting to listen. All those empires had been and gone, the chief said to the newcomer, driven away by the orcs. Not always on the first try, mind. But every time they got killed off, the chief explained, plucking a tuft of fungus from behind his ear for emphasis, the orcs came back. They grew out of holes in the ground, just like the newcomer had done, until there were enough of them to get the job done proper. And once a set of interlopers had been driven off, they never came back. Apart from the humans, that was. Because of all the creatures that ever offended Gork and Mork with their presence in the galaxy, the humans were the thickest. They thought if they believed something, it must be true, just like orcs did. Only it didn't actually work for humans. So even though they'd been kicked off Urk by the orcs twice now, they still held on to the mad idea that the planet belonged to them. The chief went quiet then, gazing out the window of the brew hut towards the mountains. The newcomer followed their eyes and saw a cluster of tiny cold lights like rubbish stars on the tallest crag in the range. "That's a human fort," the chief said, draining their brew pot grimly and slamming it on the table before kicking a grot for another. "Beakies. Big armoured gits packed in cans. They left it here to spy on us right under our noses, and somehow we ain't burned it down yet. What do you reckon, stripling? Have I gone soft or something?" The newcomer thought about their options. They were keen to insult the chief, as it had mean a good fight, but they looked at those lights and realised that they might mean the best fight of all. It was a weird idea, but something about it made their head tingle. So they went with Mork and only insulted the chief a little bit. "Nah," they said, "not soft. Old, though. Had a lot of good fights, taken a lot of knocks to the head. You forget things. All right, though. Why don't we smash it up when the sun rises?" The chief's face folded up in confusion as they tried to work out how angry they were. But then the idea hit them properly, and their frown fell off into a roaring, spit-spraying laughter. "Listen up," they bellowed to the crowded hut, lurching up so fast they nearly banged their skull on the hut's rafters. "The gods have given me a big idea," they half lied, tapping their scar-riven skull with one talon before stabbing it out towards the night. "See that beaky fort up on Ruckblood Peak? I've had enough of it. As soon as the sun's up, we're going to do it in. Full assault. Heavies at the front and—" They thought for a second. Everyone else at the front and all. But first, they finished, as a crooked grin spread behind the rusted iron teeth of their fight jaw, we're gonna drink this hut dry, bruise-free until it runs out, so get stuck in. If anyone's not got a headache by tomorrow, I'll be giving 'em one. As it happened, that fight would turn out to be the newcomers' last. At the start, it looked like it all come to nothing. As the full strength of Gogduff charged the gates in the narrow pass, there was no response except the clang of their own choppers on the human metal, and a roar of disappointment went up. The humans hadn't left anyone behind to fight. But while the fort, or the monitoring outpost, as your lot called it, might have been empty of actual humans, it weren't defenceless. As soon as someone started prizing armour off the gates for a scrap, a row of squat little turrets rose out of the wall with a nasty quiet whir, and then they found their aim and made a big, big noise. It was the worst kind of fight, with loads dead and no violence more satisfying than hacking up machines. Gogduff's orcs won, but the spoils didn't come close to making up for losses. Of 8 many orcs who went up the mountain, just many and 4 were still standing when the last turret got wrenched off its mountings. The newcomer wasn't among them. They weren't dead, but they weren't walking home neither, and since Goths didn't do carrying, that meant they'd been left for dead. It was fair enough, but as the last survivors limped away, the newcomer couldn't even hear their boots on the scree, because they only had one ear left to start with. But more importantly, 'cause the bit of the brain that dealt with noises was 3 many tusk lengths away, splattered across the rock with half the insides of their skull. With one shaky, nearly numb hand, they pawed at what was left of their face. The eye that couldn't see out of was gone, along with most of the face around it, leaving just a deep, ragged crater. When one of their legs started spasming like a squig with a chopper in its spine, they decided to stop probing to see how deep it went. They did not know where they were. They did not know how they got there. All they could see was the sky, and they did not know what that was. If they could have seen anything else, they wouldn't have known what it was neither. The newcomer hadn't even been given a name, so at least they couldn't lose that. But otherwise, everything they learned in their short life had been ripped out of their head by that bolter shell. Everything, that is, but the knowledge of the gods. Somehow, whatever glob of meat held the names of Gork and Mork had clung on tight to the bone as the slug had torn through everything else. And that bit of brain seemed to throb now, even as the blood that made it alive trickled away into the dirt through the hole in the back of the newcomer's head. So the newcomer thought about the gods and demanded divine intervention to get them out of this mess. When no answer came, they roared in anger, but all that came out of their gob was a weak hiss. Gork and Mork didn't stay quiet 'cause they were offended, yeah? It's fine to boss the gods around, so as long as you remember they don't have to listen. Nah, they were quiet, 'cause sometimes the gods say things best when they stay silent. They were telling the newcomer that this mess was their own to sort out, and if they could do that, then they might be worth listening to. That seemed fair enough, so the dying orc did the only thing that made sense. They got up, held their brains in, and went to find someone who could fix their head.
Interrogation 2. As Biter narrated the aftermath of the nameless orc's wounding, Fawkes found her attention was focused more on the words of the prisoner themselves. Although she could not understand them, the fervour of its tone was intriguing. It spoke with relish, tongue flicking over its fangs as if recalling a sumptuous meal rather than a catastrophic head injury. While by its own admission the Gretchen simply enjoyed seeing others injured, Fawkes felt there was more to it than that. It was as if the wound had been a turn of great fortune in the young Gazkul's story, rather than a monumental setback. Unconsciously, Fawkes's hand went to the back of her neck, where her fingers found the place just above the base of her skull, where stubble parted around a 2-inch oval of polished ceramite. That had been the work of a crack sconacella rather than a bullet, and the creature had left her brain intact after cutting away the skull as food for its growing larvae. Luckily, Brother Hendrickson had carved the thing off her before too many eggs had been laid, and an unpleasant hour with a mirror and a las scalpel had been enough to tidy up the damage. It wasn't much of a wound, really. But even so, Folks had enough familiarity with cranial trauma to know it was an odd thing to celebrate. Then, as the prisoner's jabbering continued, she noticed it fondling that grubby necklace it wore, rubbing each lump of metal in turn with a ritualistic, almost tender precision. And on one of the pieces, worn almost smooth by years of such fidgeting, she saw what looked a lot like the edge of a stylized winged sword. "That's the shell that split Gazkul's head, isn't it?" she asked, gesturing at the vile adornment with her chin as she snatched her hand back from her head. "Those are its shards," Biter relayed the question, cutting across the prisoner's reminiscence, and the grot shot the interpreter an angry, crestfallen squint before curling its lip and muttering a few short phrases. "Quite the opposite, Macari insists," said Biter, clearly omitting some more colourful comments. "They say it is the shell that birthed Gazkul." "Checks out," offered Cassia with a shrug. "That necklace had a real hum to it, brain-wise. That's been bothering me ever since he came aboard. Smells green, I guess, and that'd be why. I suppose this really is Macari, then." Hendrickson exhaled loudly then, getting up from the crate he'd been half sitting on throughout the account, and resuming his habitual pacing. "Don't forget, young Steinblockhead, I sense the warped strangeness of the necklace just as keenly as you do, though I would scorn as ever your calling it a smell. But yes, it is surely made from the shell which passed through Gazkul. Trust the sons of the lion to make ammunition so poor it turns foot soldiers into conquerors." He snorted in amusement at his own joke, but his frown remained. "Even so, it proves nothing. This runt could be any fleck of scum netted up by opportunist brigands and given a tall tale to tell, then handed this trinket to justify their price." "I dunno, said Cassia, folding her tree-root arms with a creak of canvas as she leaned back against the doorframe. "This ain't your average grot. And if that tale's a blood-axe fiction, it sounded damn convincing to me." "By Ross, hairy knuckles, girl, your head's big enough. Think with it. Does it not occur to you that there's something missing from this story? Something small and green that stinks like Carnick's piss?" "Orm makes a point," interjected Folks, before the pair could get too entrenched in their bickering. "This creature speaks of Thraka's life with astonishing detail, and yet it had not offered a single word to account for its own presence in the tale." The grot muttered again, still sullen from being interrupted in its description of a good maiming, and Biter spoke up. "This is because they did not exist at the time," they said cryptically. "So this is hearsay, then," scoffed Hendrickson. "Threadbare legend, which we could pick up from any greenskin in 1,000 different variations to boot." "Oh, no," argued the orc with uncanny delicacy. "It is the truth. This is what Gazkul experienced." "Because Gazkul said so, right?" asked Cassia, as even her credulity stretched thin. "Because Macari saw it all," corrected Biter, in what they probably thought was a mysterious tone. But they just said, began Fawkes, as both Cassia and Hendrickson protested the contradiction at the same time.
It is complicated,
Biter insisted, holding up the backs of their hands to placate them in another of their off-key attempts at human body language.
But it will be explained if you will be patient.
Hendrickson pressed his lips together to contain his outburst and looked to Fawkes for guidance. As hot-tempered as he was, he did sometimes manage to remember who was in charge after all.
Urged to patience by a representative of the most reckless species known to humanity,
she murmured, largely to herself, as she glanced down at her boots to find her calm.
What an exciting new departure this was.
Very well, Orc. We are not short of time, after all. But your promise of an explanation is noted. Do not test my lenience too long in keeping it. At her nod, the prisoner's account continued. But it wasn't long before the story was interrupted again. The Gretchen had claimed that the Orc had walked alone across 200 miles of badlands before reaching what passed for civilization at a place called Rustspike. Apparently, not only had they held their ruined skull together the whole way, but they had also stopped to fight no less than 3 ferocious beasts en route. This was too much for Brother Hendrickson.
Orcs hold together well,
he said, stabbing a finger into his palm for emphasis.
I will give them that, but I know a thing or two about seeing off wild beasts in the wilderness. From the winter I took the spirit of the wolf.
Fawkes, of course, knew all about wilderness beast fights too, given how often Hendrickson found excuses to tell the story of his initiation rites. As Cassia looked over and cast a faint image over Fawkes's mind's eye of a haggard tally mark being added to a wall already scratched with hundreds, it was hard not to smirk. And sure enough, Hendrickson proceeded to boast his way through a string of animal murders, complete with oversold mimings of each death blow, as Biter's blank red eyes looked on.
And no feat such as that,
he concluded, with a summative flex of his shoulders,
could be boasted of by a creature who undertook it with half a head.
The prisoner grinned, as a much abbreviated version of Hendrickson's argument was relayed to it, and leaned forward to stare mockingly at the Space Marine as it answered.
Unless you're the Orc, that will become Gaz Act1.
Biter translated, then looked shifty, as if unsure whether to translate the rest of the prisoner's speech as well.
Makari also made a reference to the, durability of space wolves, which I did not fully hear.
Hendrickson stiffened, despite Biter's attempt at diplomacia, his eyes growing pale and hard as if seen through ice. But Cassia spoke before his rage could crystallize further.
I heard another story. It was doing the rounds at the trenches back on Carchemish, though I don't know where it came from. This version had it that after Gazcall got shot, he got dragged away by his own mob. They'd heard about some messed-up Orc doctor paying good money for bad injuries, so they drove him across the Badlands and sold him for a few handfuls of bullets. Sounds more believable to me.
Is that true? Fawkes asked Biter wearily, and the Orc held up a claw as they conferred with the prisoner.
Yeah,
they stated simply. So Makari lied, then?
No,
said Biter.
No more riddles,
growled Hendrickson, his patience stretched as far as it would go.
Is the first account true or the second?
The grot made a single gesture, which earned it a resentful glare from Biter, and the orc spoke through what seemed to be a cringe.
Yeah?
They answered, and Fawkes took a deep, steadying breath. Nearly an hour had passed by the time the situation was resolved, and even then it was more an expedient way out of the headache the argument was giving everyone than a true resolution. As far as it could be grasped, orcoid minds seemed capable of believing more than one objective truth at the same time. Indeed, they could hold several entirely contradictory facts in their conscious reckoning at once, and not feel the slightest bit of mental discomfort. In the end, and with some irony, they had agreed to disagree. But before the prisoner's account could continue, the Death Watch veteran had found one more bone to pick.
Gazkul is a he,
he grumbled, wagging a finger at Biter, and receiving an uncertain grunt in reply.
You keep saying they,
Hendrickson clarified,
but Gazkul is a he. But he is not a man,
said Biter, their brow ridge creased in bafflement. Fawkes cut in then before another messy debate could ensue. We've been through this, orcs have no reproductive anatomy, and consequently no understanding of sex or gender.
Some of us understand sex and gender,
interrupted Biter, keen as ever to demonstrate their unusual expertise in humans.
I find it all quite funny.
Silence, orc, Fawkes snapped, impatient to get back on track.
From now on, Gazkul is a he, whether it makes sense or not.
As you wish, the interpreter said, casually inspecting the rust-eaten buckles on the sleeve of their greatcoat, then turning to address the Gretchen in their own tongue.
Smack snoot runt, mifbark, lag ok boskit Gazkul ognir, boys!
At that, the Gretchen broke out into frantic, snivelling yelps, which Fawkes would have taken for the onset of some sort of mental collapse if she hadn't known it was laughter, and which prompted a snort of amusement from Biter. But the interpreter knew they had pushed their luck with the aside, and after one look on Fawkes's face, urged the smaller creature on in a language they could all understand. A vicious blow to the temple.
Chapter 2. Gazkul dies for a while. When I first met Gazkul, he was dead. Of course, he wasn't quite Gazkul, and I wasn't quite me either, but he was definitely dead. For a while. He'd arrived in the middle of the night and had been on Doc Grotznick's table until just before sunrise. That was near enough a miracle in itself, because even war bosses, usually ones who run out of cash, mind, rarely made it an hour on that slab without either getting fixed or drifting into the wrong side of kill or cure. In fact, word around the Rust Spike brew huts was that Grotznick only stayed in business and in one piece because none of the surgery's failures lived to make a complaint. This patient should have died plenty of times. He just didn't fancy it. Dying wouldn't even have been a big deal usually, but he had a strange feeling he was just getting started, and he wanted to stick around to find out what he was just getting started with. Grotznick didn't make it easy. By the peak of the operation, the parent's head had been taken apart like a 40 shooter, with all the bits laid out on a bench to have more grease slapped on them. He'd gotten through a whole cage of transfusion squigs, and he probably didn't have a drop of his original blood left. He didn't have too much of his brain either. What the turret had left him with had ended up stapled to a medley of scraps from the dingy bucket where Grotznick kept his cuttings, and which were now a bit ripe, having not been refrigerated in 3 days. But a bit of that original brain that mattered held on, and made quick work of bullying the rest into line. Grotznick, of course, was gleeful. Operations this complicated never lasted long enough to be any fun, but this was something special. So special, in fact, that the doc decided to break out a bit of kit that he'd been waiting for just such a day, and which was probably worth more than everything else in that grimy medical tent put together. It was a bit of metal. Really, really hard metal, though. If the scav who brought it into the dock was to be believed, it was the arse plate of a human Terminator, found under some distant dune in a crumped aircraft whose cockpit time knower had said it was many years old. Grotznick had it figured that if the metal was like fungus grog and got better with age, this had to be a gawk-smacked good bit of metal, so the doc had shanked the scav immediately and ran off into the night with the mysterious plate. Here at last was a patient stubborn enough to match it, and as Mork would have it, the plate turned out to be the perfect shape for holding in their new thinking meat. So with a bit of saw work and a few rivets, on it went, leaving room for a bionic eye to boot. Better yet, the patient was still breathing when the last clamp was attached. The operation had been a success. Unfortunately, Grotznick was too excited to stop there. So Gazcal ended up going straight into a pioneering knee replacement op the doc had been wanting to try for ages. That worked too, with the bionic joint being slightly better than the healthy knee it had replaced. But that bit of extra blood loss was the cannon that broke the squiggest back. By the time the doc had wiped the worst of the gore off his hands in the grey light of pre-dawn, the patient was stone dead. Grotznick wouldn't have minded that much, though. It was more the doing of medicine that motivated him than the outcomes. The patient was rolled off the table with a wet thud and dragged to the back flap of the tent by whatever down-on-his-luck goon Grotznick had hired to shift corpses that week. By the time they'd been hoyed on the failure pile in the yard out back, the doc would have forgotten all about them. But when something stops being an Orcs problem, it usually becomes a Grotz. And by Mork's filthy lies, that weren't ever truer than at Grotznick's. Once bodies ended up on the pile, it was the job of Grotznick's lowliest orderly, an overworked grot who lived under 2 sheets of corrugated metal at the edge of the yard, to prize out any functioning bionics with a rusty getting stick, put 'em back in Grotznick's bits box, and chop the rest up for the squig pence. And that's where I come into the story, 'cause I was the grot. I think so, anyway. Someone had to be, and since I remember being the grot, I suppose it was me. I got up with a groan, grabbed my getting stick, and got to work. It was barely light in the yard still, and the ground was bitter cold, but the doc would want this body cleared before it started drawing git swarms, so I didn't waste any time. Grotznick's last 2 yard grots had both died from trying to get bits off Orcs who weren't quite dead yet, so I gave the body a good few jabs with the getter just to be sure. Then I jumped on its chest to start levering that shiny plate off its head. But as soon as my getter touched metal, there was a sharp crack, and I stumbled back, feeling like I'd jammed my hand in a charged-up zap coil. The body started twitching. Then it started shaking, and then it was properly thrashing around, clawing blindly at its new skull bits like it was trying to find something. It went completely rigid for a second, every muscle tense so hard I thought something was going to snap, and then sat bolt upright, mouth wide open, in what was either complete confusion or some kind of awe, like it had seen something mega. But before I could work out what was happening, the body grabbed me by the shoulder, and I had the same shock I'd gotten from the getter, only longer and burnier and worse, because the body wouldn't let go. It held on till steam started coming off me, but I didn't have long to worry about that, because that was when the body looked right at me, and in its one proper eye was a green, so green that it became the universe. I've had visions before. Most grots in Rutspike had. We weren't allowed in the brew huts or the fight sheds, so on the rare times when we managed to dodge our graft, we'd gather in groups of the grots we hated least, and guzzle the skinny mushrooms that grew in the warp-heads drops on the edge of town. They weren't much good, those visions. They were just headaches with colours, really. This, though, this was something else. This was an audience with the gods. It was nothing to start with, just dark and damp and cold. And then way up above, there was a voice. Voices, in fact. They were so big and so deep, it was hard to tell what language they were speaking, let alone what they said. But it must have been Gork and Mork. And they were fighting, which is fine, because that's what they like doing best. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Massive, rumbling impacts that made the dark thunder, and would have knocked me off my feet if I'd had any kind of presence. And then, a spark. A tiny little mote of green, bright and hungry, drifting down through many, many, many tusk lengths till it touched the floor of wherever I was. The green spread out from that tiny point, rippling in big bright circles and pooling in spots that spread circles of their own. It spread faster and faster until everything was covered in it, as far as I could see. Now it was lit up. I could see I was in some kind of cavern, or rather a big twisting mess of caverns, like the cells in a hive of sugar gits, but massive. The walls were meaty, I reckon is the word, damp and red and crinkly, like the folds in a brain, which I'd seen enough of in my brief life to know well enough. As the green gathered on them, they changed. They started sprouting fungus, moulds and slimes at first, the sort of stuff you eat when there's a dust storm on and the orcs have had all the good grub. But then, muckworts and bile caps and huge complicated things like nothing that grew on Urk. And just like it is outside of Holy Visions, wherever the fungus grew, so did other green things. Squiglets first, the kind so small you can only see them as mean little specks digging into your armpits. Then squigs as big as talon tips and fists and heads. Next came snotlings, who are to grots what we are to orcs, crawling and yipping and scrapping with each other in big writhing piles. Everywhere there were snotlings eating squigs and squigs eating snotlings. And with every jaw snap, gnash and gnaw, the green grew brighter and more alive. Then there were grots, swarms of grots, and they got straight to work, lashing together meagre little tools from squig sinew and catwood, and bullying the snots into working too. Faster than I could keep up with, they beat the fungal jungle back and started building farms and drops and brew huts and barracks. They were just in time for the first orcs, who were clawing their way out of their grow holes now and were hungry already. The orcs kept coming, and they kept getting bigger until even the runts among them were as big as the war bosses on Urk. And above it all, way up on what might have been the cavern roof or might have been infinity, the stars were coming out. More stars than every mech on Earth could have counted in a lifetime, and every one of them that bright, angry, beautiful green. I was so distracted by the stars that I didn't see the squig off. It was a brilliant thing, a horrible thing. As big as a battle wagon it was, and it made the skinny, sag-throated beast raised by Urk's snake-bite herders look pathetic. It nearly smashed me to mush with its foot. But I didn't live to 3 years old by not being able to roll out the way of a stomp morksnick fast, and once I was on my feet, I followed the beast. I don't know why, but it felt right. Soon there was a whole herd of squigoffs lumbering along at something like a gallop, barging into each other with enough force to flatten forts. I ran along with them through that untamable garden, and I didn't care if they stamped me flat, because it felt like fear wasn't something worth feeling in this place. Up above now, where the green stars shone, there were warriors. Huge orcs, perfect orcs, every one bigger than a clan chief, and rippling with green light. I don't know how I knew, but they was orcs as they was meant to be. They glowed bright enough to outshine the stars, and they strode through the sky. I could feel the gods above them grinning down in violent pride. And then clashes and booms and roars started to come from up ahead. The giants were wading into a scrap. It was hard to see what was going on, given I was looking up from between the flanks of the galloping squigoffs, but it was a big, big, big fight. It kept getting bigger, and I think the orcs won. Surely they couldn't have lost. But then when the noises of the fight faded away, the presence of the gods did too. It was like the whole cavern got cold and dark again, like it had been to start with. The squiggers stopped in their tracks, and so did every other thing in the whole of the great green. It was like everything was lost suddenly, looking around and wondering what to do now. Of course, they started fighting. It was a frenzy above and below, from the giants trading punches like comet strikes in the sky to the snotlings wrapping skinny claws around each other's necks down below. And with no gods to bang everyone's heads together and tell them to pack it in, it went on until the whole place was like a butcher's tent, and there'd been enough murders for the survivors to have some space. It weren't peaceful then, but it weren't a bloodbath neither, because all the really hard things, like the orcs in the sky, were dead. It went on for ages like that. There were orcs still, but they were nothing like the colossal fighters who'd been there before, and they was all struck down on the cavern floor. Watching them was a bit like watching raindrops get swiped away by a truck's hatch wipers. Every time one got big enough to seem like it might make it up to the sky, all the others nearby ganged up and beat it into shreds, so none of them got as big as they should have been. Until one did, that is. It wasn't even that big when it got attacked, but it properly demolished every orc that came at it, delivering headbutts like point-blank cannon strikes and pulling any survivors into line to fight alongside it. As more and more enemies flooded in, the fighter got larger, and so did the pile of bodies in front of it. Green lightning started to strike all around it, and soon that body pile reached all the way up to the sky. Seeing this, the new giant began climbing the mountain of the dead towards the stars. With every step, the winner grew more bulky, more vigorous, and soon the cavern started glowing bright again. The stars swelled, and I knew that Gork and Mork were back somehow. Or they'd never been gone, but had just lost interest for a while until there'd been something worth looking at again. Soon, the champion reached the top of the body pile, where the stars had grown so big there was no black left between them, and it stood there for a moment, like it was thinking. Looking up at that titan, which had horns now, as well as loads of arms bearing all sorts of different guns and choppers, I was terrified. But I also knew what joy was for the very first time. And then the titan looked back down at me. There were spaceships flitting across the green sea of its one good eye, looking like tiny bingits. And as the full weight of that glare bore down on me, I thanked the gods they had let me die like this. But the giant didn't kill me. It curled a finger big enough to flick a moon into a planet, and it beckoned me. Then it turned and stepped into glorious infinite green, leaving only flames in its boot prints. When I came back around in the yard again, Gaz Act1 was standing over me. It was him. He looked bigger than the body he'd been, somehow. He looked down at me with an eye which, though it was red like a normal one, held the exact same expression that had been turned on me at the deep end of that vision. And as he looked at me, I wasn't sure it was me anymore. I was me instead. But there wasn't time to think much, because rather than beckoning me like the giant had done, Gazkal was thrusting his finger towards my face, and I will never forget the first words I heard from him. "Now listen close," he said, "or I'll batter you." As much of an impression as that left, mind, you'll likely be more interested in what he said next. After tracing a claw along the ridge of ugly staples bordering his shiny new bonce and scowling with satisfaction, he sank down to one knee so we were eye to eye and spoke again. "Some orcs are clever. Some orcs are strong. I'm both." That was it. He'd say more in time, but at that moment it was all he needed to say. Truth is, I've never heard anyone sum up Gazkal more neatly than Gazkal did right there in Glotsnick's yard. And as soon as he spoke, we both knew I was bound to him, as simply and as unbreakably as that plate that was clamped to his skull. I didn't know where this orc had come from, besides the failure pile, but I knew where it was going. Gork and Mork had such big plans for this one, and they spilled into my head when he touched me. This orc was going to turn the stars green, and I knew that somehow, in some way, I didn't need to understand yet, I was part of the plan. Well, what can you do when your whole idea of what life's about gets kicked apart in an instant? Well, I did what any good grot would do in my position. I told the prophet of Gork and Mork there was something behind him, so he turned round to look, and then I ran like a squig with his arse on fire before I could get dragged into something dangerous.
Interrogation 3.
You ran?
Asked Cassia through gritted teeth, crabbing her hands against her temples as she spoke. During the grot's description of its supposed holy vision, Fawkes had felt a headache coming on, but to the psychers in the cell, it had been an ordeal. Even Hendrickson, for all his celebrated mental discipline, had a queasy look, as if he were trying to keep down a half-keg of used engine oil.
Of course they ran, said Biter, as if defending the prisoner's honour. They's a grot.
But you said you felt a bond with Gazkul, said Fawkes to the captive, more interested in what it had to say than Biter's editorial commentary. She received a sneer and a dismissive mutter in response.
Yeah, they say,
Biter clarified,
but also they's a grot. A grot's bond of service cannot be sincere if it is not tested repeatedly by attempts to shirk it. Constant recalcitrance,
offered Brother Hendrickson irritably.
Yeah, recalcitrance is, you could say, a way of making sure a master has good wits.
Fawkes scratched at the scarring around her cranial plate and turned to Cassia. The vision pained you, Cassia. Is the grot a psyker?
No such thing as a grot psyker,
said the Ogren psyker, then grunted in mild annoyance as Fawkes raised an eyebrow at the irony.
Or at least there's no such thing on this ship. Like I said when I smelled 'em out before we started, there's something to this one, but it ain't that.
She's right, Hendrickson announced, with more than a little bluster. He never liked it when Fawkes went to Cassia first with questions of the mental arts, after all.
There is something to him, and there was something to that too, the vision. But even within the crude witch lore of the greenskins there are tricks, crude resonances which can be cast in a lesser being to impart a sense of power, or to deepen the fidelity of forgery. Not that I would contradict you,
wheedled Biter, brow ridges lifting as they raised a talon,
but look.
Hendrickson swung his shaggy head towards the prisoner and harumphed. The grot had pulled down the collar of its jerkin to reveal a great blackened mark in the rough shape of an orc palm print seared across its shoulder. Fawkes was sure it had not been there when they'd scanned the creature for explosives. But now she could even see the lumpy ridges where the prisoner's skin had bubbled up around the burn.
The hand of the boss,
said Biter quietly, failing to conceal a near infrasonic growl of awe while the prisoner's face stretched into a mean, tight-lipped smile.
The handiwork of a blood-axe trickster,
contested Hendrickson. We shall see, said Fawkes. The evidence that Makari did indeed sit before them was certainly mounting. But she had learned long ago that Hendrickson's instinct for a ruse was to be ignored at her peril. For every 9 false positives, his 10th suspicion would be the one that saved them from a devourer cult patriarch or a Golmare face-wearer, and he seemed more certain than ever that they were being deceived. She would have to take measures. Sub-vocalizing a command to the chamber's servo-skull, she sent it puttering off to the brig's entrance with a message for the warden of the ship's vivarium. She would wake Sottle, and then they would have the truth. But for now, she bade the prisoner continue.
"I didn't make it many and 5 tusk lengths, mind," translated Biter. "The second I was up off the dust, Gazcall kicked back with his heel. It was the leg, with the new knee on it and all, and without even turning round, he punted a rock right at the back of my skull. Masterful it was. Knocked me down flat, as absently as if he was swatting a binget off his brew, and all the while he kept looking at the flap that led back into Grotsnick's tent."
"He was thinking," said Fawkes.
"No,"
said the prisoner, with sarcasm so poisonous it required no clarification from Biter in translation.
"He was scratching his arse, course he was thinking, and since his brain was busy, he told me to write down everything I'd seen in the vision so he could think about it later. That was a problem, though."
"Why?"
"Nothing to write with, gut brains."
Biter's face froze after saying that, as the orc calculated whether they had gone too far in getting into the spirit of the Gretchen's words, and the grot cackled at their predicament. But Fawkes had been called much worse, and made a rolling gesture with one hand to keep the account flowing.
"The doc had a can of paint for surgical markings, but it dried up years back when he started eyeballing his cuts, and all I owned in the world was 2 sheets of metal I lived under, plus my getting stick. So Gazcall told me to stab him in the leg with the getter, and use his blood to write with."
From the look on the grot's face as Biter relayed this last detail, this was a particularly treasured memory. "I thought your kind had no written language beside crude hieroglyphs," queried Fawkes.
"Writing, drawing, same word for us," said Biter. "Same word as fighting, but you say it quieter with less, I just say."
At that, the orc's eyes flared, and they let out a vicious, abrupt growl that made every muscle in Fawkes's back stiffen at once, and had Hendrickson's knife out of its sheath in a heartbeat. The ferocity was gone at once, but it was as if a vile sun had briefly glimmered through clouds, for all of their bizarre affectations and their fascination with diplomacia. She reminded herself this was just another beast that happened to wear a most unusual mask. "Quite," she said, with a smile as thin and precise as a duellist's blade as Biter grinned back at her.
"Anyway,"
the translator continued, clearing their throat with a sound like a shovel stuck in a bilge pump and taking on their Macari voice again.
"I grabbed the metal sheet that was half of my house and started to write down the vision. Only the most important bit, though, that massive, perfect orc with the horns and all the arms holding guns, standing on a big pile of bodies with spaceships going round its head. I had to get fresh paint a couple of times, and I waggled the getter in the hole a bit more than I had to when I did. But Gazcall didn't even flinch. He just kept staring at the tent like he was getting ready for something. It was to Gazcall's liking, at least. He only kicked me lightly after I gave it to him, and after turning it a little to see how it caught the light, he worked his thumb into one of the gaps between his head stitches and anointed the image with the gore of his holy wound. He tore the strapping from an old boot lying in the dust, used it to lash the metal sheet to my getting stick, and then it was a banner."
"What then?"
asked Fox. "Then he gave it to me, and he gave me a name, and then, just like that, I existed."
Chapter 3. Gaz Cole's Big Fight. "Macari," said Gaz Cole after looking at me for a few seconds. Wasn't a name I'd heard before. I'm still not totally sure he weren't just clearing his throat. Didn't matter, though. I might have lost 2 of my 3 possessions to make the banner, but I gained a name, and that was treasure. Like most grots, I never had one beyond Git or you, for the same reason you wouldn't bother naming a bit of wood or a polishing rag or a bullet. Grots are there to be used up, but if an orc names something, he means to keep it. I had a new job and all.
"You'll hold that. Where I go, you go, and you hold it high,"
said the boss.
"so they know who's coming."
"What if they don't know what it means?" I asked, risking a beasting for talking back. But Gazcal just snorted.
"Then I'll teach 'em,"
he said, cracking his knuckles with a noise like a butcher pulling a leg off a squig. Then he gave a shiny adamantium-plated nod to the tent flap.
"Best get started."
Gazcal walked right past Grotsnick's goons into the main bit of the tent, which served as Grotsnick's operating theatre. The doc himself was there, with his earlier failure already forgotten, and his arms up to the elbows in the belly of Rustspike's smelter boss. The doc hissed with frustration and turned around with his eyes smouldering like furnace slag in their baggy sockets. He was ready to cut whoever dared walk in on his procedure. But when he saw the intruder was his patient back from the dead, it was like he'd stood on a sandgit with no boots on. Those nasty eyes went wide with alarm, because he knew he was about to get a pasting. But then they even went wider in excitement, because he saw that his surgery had worked after all. The doc was so thrilled, in fact, he stood bolt upright with half the smelter boss gut still in his hands. That didn't make the smelter boss very happy, but his griping stopped soon enough when he clapped eyes on Gazcole, just like Grotsnick. He could smell the danger in the room. I was really looking forward to seeing the doc get hammered into the ground after all the beatings he'd given me over the years. But Gazcole steamed straight through the operating room, ignoring the doc altogether, and headed for the tent's entrance flap. "Where I go, you go," he'd said. So what could I do but follow? If the doc was bothered to see me saunter out of the tent behind the living corpse, he didn't let on. Perhaps he realised I wasn't the same grot anymore. Perhaps he didn't want to push his luck. Either way, he said nothing as Gazcole ducked under the rolled-up hide door and walked out into the light of morning in Rustspike. The place wasn't a fort, you understand. Wasn't a city neither, though it might as well have been. 6 many Death Skull orcs lived there, with more arriving every day, but they still called Rustspike a camp. It had been once. It had just been a single tent, actually, at the start. A few sheets of squig hide draped over a prospector's truck right where its engine had failed, next to a big rusty spike of metal in the Badlands. But Mork had fancied a laugh that day, and when the prospector had gotten to digging for gubbins, he found the spike was the tip of a tower. There was a whole human city down there, it had turned out, covered in dust and rocks, and never looted once. Well, it got looted plenty after that, and Rustspike had got fat off the loot. The sun was just climbing up over the jumble of the camp skyline, throwing long shadows down the street, so a great black giant slid ahead of Gazcole as he walked. It was like the orc who climbed the sky in the vision was half there, its shadow leading him down the street. We were lucky it was early, too, as the knee-deep slurry of junk and squig turds that covered the truckway was still half frozen from the night. It had been a river by noon, but for now it crackled under Gazcole's boots and held my weight so I didn't have to wade. It was quiet, A lone grinder was throwing up sparks in the cave-like wagon garages of the mech shop across the way, and there were only a couple of brawls underway deep in the big brew hut next to Grotznick's as the last revellers settled their tabs before heading back to work. Given the state he'd arrived in at the doc's tent during the night, this would have been Gazcole's first look at proper civilization. He didn't seem impressed. He just stood there, looking it all over for a long while, and I stood a few steps behind him, holding his banner for nobody to see and feeling like a right fool. But I knew better than to ask what he was waiting for, and I was right to keep my trap shut. Because that morning, I learned that when Gazcole expects something, it doesn't take long for it to happen. A racket started up down the far end of the truckway, where it turned a corner round the bullet mill and snaked out to the camp's main gate. I couldn't see what was causing it because of the bullet mill, but I reckon it was either a fight or celebration. And I turned out to be half right twice. It was a celebration of a fight, and its source was only bloody Dregmek, the warlord of all the death skulls on Urk, with his entire retinue walking along with him. Dregmek was a big orc, easily 5 times Gazcole's weight and taller than the two of us would have been if we were stacked up. And that weren't even counting his armour. Dregmek's rig was a one-off, hammered together from alien bones out of the eastern desert, then plated with an extra layer of lead sheet, because the warlord didn't reckon it was heavy enough. Hydraulics hissed as he plodded towards us, and as he bragged to his cronies, his huge blue-striped fight jaw bobbed up and down in time with his real one. Just from the mimed punches he swung at the air as he swaggered along, I could tell he was boasting to his mates about a fight. They'd all have been there too, of course, but none of them wanted a crumping, so they roared with laughter and surprise as their boss recounted every blow. Like any grot, the only thought that crossed my mind when faced with an approaching boss mob drunk on a big win was the impulse to run and hide in a very small place. But Gazcole had told me to hold the banner, so I stayed and held the banner. If Dregmeg's lot came at Gazcole, I figured I could always revise my options. It didn't come to that, though, because Gazcole came for them. Just walked right towards Dregmeg, chin thrust out like a truck's ram with nothing to fight with but his hands. I would have run then if I'm honest, but I was too shocked.
"You're an offence to the gods,"
said Gazcole. It weren't even a challenge, just a statement. A fact bland as a fungus biscuit, like he'd pointed out that Dregmeg was wearing blue armour. And though he didn't even shout, it carried all the way down the street, echoing off the buildings, and stopped the chant in mid-flow. Dregmeg looked at Gazcole with his brows crunched up in confusion. And then he looked around at his mates, and they looked back, and they all laughed at once, as loud as a row of crump trucks opening fire.
"You what, run?"
rumbled Dregmek, after he had enough of laughing, and beckoned for the gang of grots who carried his gun to lift the 8-barrelled cannon into his hand.
"You heard,"
said Gazcole, as he began winding the crank on the weapon's Daka gauge to get all the bits charged. Dregmek squinted at the smaller orc over the jagged teeth of his fight jaw. Back in the camp's early days, he'd got a bionic eye off of Grotznick, and his testimonial of "suppose it's an eye" was still daubed proudly over the door of the doc's tent. But that was about the best you could say of the prosthetic. With Gazcole standing many tusk lumps away on the truckway and the sun rising behind him, Dregmek was having a hard time seeing his accuser. But then he clocked the check marks on Gazcole's leather armour, the same armour he'd worn to Gogduff's assault on the human outpost, and his good eye shifted from a squint to a crinkle of violent excitement.
"Now hang on, lads," said Dregmeg to his crew with relish. "Am I seeing this right? Is this a goth runt walking about in my town?"
He squinted again.
"No, wait. It's even better than that. It's a goth runt left over from the lot we just battered, and he's just been put back together again by Grotznick so we can finish the job."
Looking back at the tent then, as I tried to work out my odds of legging it back inside and swearing blind I'd never left, I saw Grotznick himself was standing at the door, rubbing giblets off a pair of forceps. Other faces were peering from the shadows of the doorways, balconies and looking holes all along the street, hoping to see a bit of blood.
"What is it that you're after then, runt?"
bellowed Dregmek cordially.
"I told you,"
said Gazco, like there wasn't some massive git wearing half a tank pointing an artillery piece at him.
"You're an offence to the gods. You fight other orcs, squabbling over human scrap like a snotling. You're no sort of orc, and Gork and Mork know it."
When he'd finished, Dregmek laughed again, but not as many of his cronies laughed with him this time. It wasn't the fact that Gazco wasn't afraid that unnerved them. Orcs can't be afraid, the lucky gits. It was the fact he was talking like he'd already won the fight, and Dregmek didn't know it yet. It was weird.
"I'll wait for Gork and Mork to tell me that themselves, thanks,"
said the warlord, less cheerful now, and levelled the sight of his weapons at Gazco.
"For now, you give 'em my regards after I pull this trigger and you're waiting in the Great Green to get belched into a new body. Now, do us a favour, tell us your name first so I can have it painted on this gun." "I am the warlord of warlords and the prophet of Gork and Mork. They speak through my tusks and my fists and my head. I am Gazcal, and I will bring great slaughter."
There was a long silence then, as every orc watching found another orc to look confused at. Dregmek peered at Gazcal, looking confused himself, and then shook his head.
"Yeah, that's not going to fit,"
he said, and pulled the trigger.